My name is Lewis Pitts. I was born December 12, 1947. And I was born in Clinton, South Carolina.
Well, well, let's talk a little bit of, I mean, we have so much to cover, a little about what it was like growing up, let's see, in South Carolina. Is that a small town?
Yeah, it's a small town. I moved from there when I was 10, but those were very formative first 10 years. My mom and dad both had college educations, but they were more working people. My dad was one of 7 kids, and it was quite an entrepreneurial family. He was running the family meat market, meaning they sold, his little store sold meat, beef and pork and cheese and bread, and that was about it. And I remember back in that day, you pick up the telephone and the operator would say, "Number, please," and his telephone number was 98. And that got me to my dad's store. So that meant that I got to grow up most of that time living in the country. My dad and 2 of his brothers had built brick houses side by side on a hill that overlooked the pasture and an old barn. And this is not ritzy rancher farming. This was just sort of that stuff. So he raised a few cows. There was a old horse or 2 that'd be around. I had an older cousin, Billy Boy Pitts. And we would, Saturday mornings, we would chase the horses, finally catch them and ride and play cowboys and Indians, jump out of the barn. Anyway, it was a blast. I'd go to cattle sales with him. To this day, I love to hear an auctioneer sing and call out those numbers and have those kind of memories. My mom was a school teacher. But then my dad had gone to Clemson, and I think the retail meat business wasn't what he wanted to do. And he took a job then in Bethune, South Carolina, an even smaller town, at Kendall Company. And he was a second shift night supervisor. So he kind of started almost at the bottom and then worked his way up. So we lived there. So I went to high school in a town of 600, including indoor pets. There were 24 in my high school class. And it was very isolating, but I didn't know any different. I enjoyed it. I played sports and had a steady girlfriend. And that was what I did through high school. And I had a strong upbringing in the church. On my mom's side, her dad had been a Methodist preacher. His dad had been a Methodist preacher. But that grandfather passed away before I could remember him. So I didn't ever know him. So at least I got a foundation in trying to do what's right and wrong. And growing up, at least in the Methodist church, there was a song, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loved the little children of the world. So we were not in a racist family there in South Carolina, overtly racist, not a Ku Klux Klan thing. But my gosh, when I finally got away from all that, I realized how much we were steeped in, at best, separate but equal. And so that was a real learning process. And then I'll stop now, but the summer after I graduated from high school, I started working in the summers before I went to college. And I had an experience, well, I actually had experience in my senior year. I should mention that, given that I became a civil rights activist and lawyer. I was one of 3 tri-captains of the football team my senior year. And the other 2 guys, I think one of them's father probably was in the Klan. I didn't know particularly about that. But somehow, without much to do, they convinced me to join with them. And we took sheets and red paint and took plenty of time and built a big banner that said, and spelled out Ku Klux Klan, but rides again. And then we built a smaller one with just 3 Ks on it. And one Friday or Saturday night, we strung that across the main street of Bethune from the Piggly Wiggly to the Western Auto and climbed up the water tank and taped it somehow on the water tank. Well, I had no racial hatred. I don't know how to explain that other than I was just blinded by the culture of white supremacy and segregation. And our high school newspaper was called the Dixie Cat. I looked back at it some years ago, and there's a picture of us standing at one point in front of a Confederate flag in that high school annual. So anyway, it was just astounding how much I had absorbed, maybe an implicit bias. It wasn't a hatred. But with regard to that KKK thing, I foolishly decided to ride back through town after we'd hung it. And the one town cop had already seen it and cut it down and had to lift it up for me to drive under it. And somehow by the time I got home to my parents, they were up. And I said, yeah, we did it. And what's up? And so it was a Saturday, because the next Sunday morning, we had to climb up and take it all down. And then I began to hear stories from a friend of mine's father. A buddy ran the IGA food store. And they had already begun to talk somehow, because I forgot how long it had been up, that the word spread that the Klan may be rioting again and black folks were coming into the grocery store to stock up on food. And boy, when I finally began to get conscious how awful I felt. But that summer, I was working construction on a labor crew. My dad worked at that plant, but I didn't drive a truck, man. I had a shovel, and I walked around with the 8 or 10 guys on the labor force. They were all African American, and that was a learning experience for me. But one of the plumber guys, which I thought, man, that was must be the height of sophistication to be a plumber and know how to do all that. Well, they were selling raffle tickets. The Klan was raffling a 66 Mustang. So I bought a raffle ticket, man. I didn't win it. And I didn't have any clue that I was being a moron or being racist. I went off to college to an all-white, pretty much all-white, all-male Wofford College. And actually that began to expand my horizons a bit. And then hopefully every year thereafter, I've tried to learn and grow and develop and understand better. But that was some of my beginnings dealing with the race issue.
So just back briefly to the town, were there blacks living around there?
Well, like most southern towns, there was the colored side of town, that there was no houses side by side, but there were folks in that town. In fact, we had a black maid, 1 or 2 different ones that were nice. They'd come, and at some point, back in that day, you could get a full driver's license, meaning day and night, at 14 years old. So I would sometimes drive her home, meaning to the other side of town. And at some point, I don't remember when, maybe when I was in college and was in the summer, did that. I began to realize this is bizarre. I'm sitting in the front seat and she's in the back seat. There's 2 of us in the car. And I think I offered her the opportunity, but back then that was been about as hard on her and awkward to sit up there with me. So that's just the way it went. It's horrible.
Yeah, it's hard to think back to that period. So, but your family, your parents, were religious, and they were not overtly racist at all.
No. I remember we were driving. We moved from Clinton, where the cattle and the meat market was, when I was 10. That was 1957. So to Bethune. And for a couple of years, we would regularly drive back and forth. So this was, I'm guessing, roughly 58, 59, we'd be driving it's about a 2-hour drive from Bethune to Clinton, and getting somewhere near Newberry. It was late in the afternoon or night. There was a cross being burned. And I remember my parents, I don't remember their words, but their notion that what they conveyed was, that's bad. That's not good. That was sort of not how they do it. But that other stuff of separate but equal, right in the back seat, that was very different. Now, their views evolved too. I'm talking about here, I graduated from high school in '66. But they evolved a little more and began to understand a little more.
Okay, so then let's briefly talk about your experiences at Wofford College.
Yes.
Where
WOFFORD. It's a Methodist college in Spartanburg. It's it's co-ed now. Back then it was all male. And from the time I stopped wanting to be a garbage truck driver at about 4 or 5 years old, because I thought that was cool to drive a big truck and make a lot of noise in a garbage truck, I wanted to be a medical doctor, and help people. So I went to Wofford because it supposedly has a good academic things, and being a Methodist, I got a little bit of a scholarship, so to help pay for it. But I quickly went wild. I didn't drink, smoke, or cuss, I used to say when I was in high school, but I learned to do it all at Wofford pretty quickly. And I knew I did not want to spend my college afternoons in a lab. So I gave up the notion of being a medical doctor and majored in English. And only towards the end did I decide I thought I'd go to law school. I hadn't really committed to it as a cause at that point. But at Wofford College, I candidly say 2 things. Well, a little broader base of guys, even though they were white, who were from little bigger towns, began to broaden my horizon. The other thing, I began to read Bertrand Russell. And the other thing, I smoked pot. And those things opened my head up. And I think I began to think and crave the pursuit of knowledge and the joy of understanding, even though I wasted the academic side of 4 years of college. I did just what I could do to get by, and that was about it. Let's say I drank a lot, I went to the gym a lot, and I pursued the women a lot. And that was sort of my college career. But then I began to get serious, went to law school, and I don't know, major stuff as I continued to read. And I started following Marx. I started following Eastern religion. I started paying attention to liberation theology in some fashion or another, and trying to figure out how to be a good human being, how to pursue knowledge, the joy of understanding, but more importantly, the obligation and the potential to make change in the world.
Okay, so talk about your law school experiences.
University of South Carolina in Columbia, I was there from 1970 to 73. So I often say that the 60s hit South Carolina in the early 70s. So there was anti-war stuff going on. I wasn't part of an anti-war movement, but there was a group of in our first year class that had a name called the Pettigrew Society, that were trying to do the more progressive things. So there I got exposed to an even broader category. There weren't many women law students back then. There were a few, but there were some smart people. And I was beginning to get introduced to the progressive, or what's called left. I don't like particularly left-right terms. And that's when, at some point, one of those guys, I don't recall his name, was helping and encouraging people to apply for conscientious objector status. So I should probably scroll back. To help pay for Wofford, because my family was not wealthy, at Wofford, there's basic ROTC, and then there's advanced ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, Army. So most people who aren't athletes on scholarship take ROTC. It was just promoted that way. And if you do it your junior and senior year, you actually get paid a little bit, but you're also, in return, you get commissioned as a second lieutenant and have an obligation to go in. So I'd gone through and done that. That meant we would drill every Monday or Tuesday afternoon and spit shine the shoes. And I went to a summer camp at Fort Bragg the summer after my junior year. I had a profound experience there. I was out on a compass course with an African-American guy who's kind of a militant black. So this was, I guess, 69, militant African-American guy who was attending, I forgot, some like maybe North Carolina A&T or one of them, so historically black colleges. And we were out together. Well, we kind of got lost. I didn't have any water in my canteen. I wasn't about to die, but I was kind of thirsty because you are out in the woods in Fort Bragg. And he offered me his canteen. And I was confronted with, do I drink after a black person? And anyway, that was an interesting story. It touched me, and I think I did. I don't exactly remember. Then, interesting, years later, early 80s, 1980s, that same guy was an assistant U.S. attorney in Greensboro when I had begun to represent the victims in the Greensboro massacre, which I suspect we will get to. And I was then the lefty radical representing the Communist Workers' Party, and he was the man. He was the U.S. attorney who was refusing to federally investigate. He wasn't the U.S. attorney, he was an assistant. Anyway, our roles seemed to have shifted completely that way. So I applied for conscientious objector status, had to go through those interviews. The military was saying that I didn't deserve it because it was interesting. And I still have the letters written in my behalf from people I'd worked with during law school, a judge and some other people, and my own written articulation. It was kind of fascinating here a few years ago, after 40 or 50, to go back and read what you were saying as a really a young person about your views about war and morality and those things. But anyway, at the last minute, it was granted. And so I got out and didn't have to go to service. And so I was in law school about to graduate, deciding whether I then was going to have to go in, or would I then do like some did and go to Canada, or how would I do that? And I didn't quite know. And then I got it in the mail without any to do, and that was that. So here in law school, I really got interested in, had a nice, good professor, a white guy from Mississippi, who taught a dear friend of mine, Bob Warren, and I, really about racism and civil rights lawyering, and he really helped change our world, John Timms. And I worked for the public defender as a law clerk. That's representing poor folks. That means largely poor whites and poor African Americans who were charged with the criminal justice system. And that began to lift up the covers of how much systemic racism there is, and the criminalization of poverty. And the criminalization was it was minimum back then compared to what we have now, in light of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and those kind of things. But even back then, people were demanding and saying that we had an unfair criminal, and we were imprisoning African American people disproportionately and wrongly. But anyway, I got a chance to see that part of the criminal system.
Well, so you graduated in 1973?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
And then did you know when you graduated that you wanted to do work to help people?
I stayed with the public defender office. See, that was the beginning of the constitutional right to a free lawyer if you were poor and charged with a crime. That had not long been ordained, or if you will, or articulated by a U.S. Supreme Court decision. So the state of South Carolina was starting that. And in Columbia, Richland County, there was a county public defender's office. So I stayed there for 3 years. And it was amazing. I got to do a lot of trial work. I did some appellate work. And that was a good thing to be a young, barely competent. But I remember representing an African-American man with an IQ of, if I recall, it was 53. And he was charged falsely with about, it seemed like 8 or 10 rapes. He could barely speak well, Claude Callahan. And anyway, I had just passed the bar and I had a trial. I was the lead lawyer. It was a rape of a white, beautiful co-ed at the University of South Carolina by Claude Callahan. And I know she got it wrong. And I fought and tangled with the judge. We had an appeal, but ultimately lost it. And to this day, I'm convinced that he didn't do it. And I realize how many times that can happen.
Is he still?
So after 3 years, I wanted to do a little something different. And my good buddy that I just mentioned, Bob Warren, when he graduated, he'd gone to his home town of Allendale County, which was, if I recall, 60 or more % African American. And he hung out his shingle to be a sole practitioner. This is back in the day in that county, there was no legal aid. There was no public defender. If you were poor and African American or white and poor, you didn't have much. So we tried to, without any subsidized money, tried to represent all those people. And that was an eye-opener for me also. The reason when I moved there, I moved in with Bob because he'd been happily married and had 2 kids, but he came home one day and the wife and 2 kids and all the furniture, including the shower curtain, were gone. She moved. They couldn't stand the heat. He had threatened to sue over not having an integrated pool, swimming pool, and the kids would come home and say, "Daddy, everybody says we don't have a swimming pool because of you." And so it was dangerous and all these other things, but I moved in with him and we had a blast fighting the man and raising hell and working together and seeing how the power structure worked and trying to challenge. We did not want to be part of the good old boy system, which meant economically to survive, it was going to be very hard because the judges knew if we had a case, it was supposed to be something where our client would get money and then we may get a contingency from that. They didn't want to help us. So that was quite a part of my life experiences. Well, I'll stop and see if you want to probe anymore. And tell me if I'm going too much detail.
Oh, you are going beautifully. You're so well spoken. I was just going to ask, how did you survive financially back then?
Barely. I can remember. Well, when I practiced with him, I didn't know anything about civil law. I think I knew a lot about criminal law because that's all I've done. On the civil side, even your basic automobile accident, it's what is collision insurance versus liability insurance, and calling up the insurance adjusters, and the fact that these people would buy on payment, seemed like it's from General Motors, a mobile home, a trailer to live in. It would leak, wasn't worth a damn. They would stop making the payments. They'd be hauled into court on some, debt thing, have the trailer removed, blah, blah, blah. And it was just, we couldn't. And then I remember sitting at my desk looking up at the doorway and I saw a man and it looked like some coveralls with pliers or some kind of tool. And I leaned down and said, "Bob, what's that?" He said, "He's cutting off the electricity. We haven't paid the electricity bill this month." So it went on and on like that, man. We didn't have the proverbial pot to piss in, but we ate, we didn't starve. And we had some really wonderful I don't want to bore too much with the stories, but there's just fascinating stories in the low country of South Carolina about what was going on and the racism and the violence that was going on and how few people were willing to fight it. And I'm indebted so much to Bob Warren, my dear friend who's recently passed. This is August 2020. He passed in March, who taught me a lot about understanding and loving and realizing Black people, they ain't the problem, man. It's us. And go be with them and you realize, man, they'll give you the shirt off their back. Fine, we would go to the honky tonks or juke joints, I guess it was more called out there, and were accepted because we were the fighters, and mostly in disbelief that these two young white lawyers, Warren and Pitts, would take on their cases and take it all the way to the state Supreme Court. And maybe we had a $50 retainer fee, but you just do it because you know. If you say no, that's the end of the line. In fact, that's the only time I think I kept a journal or a diary in my life. And I look back at that. It was paining me to realize, and I realized it early, what an unfair system we've got, that whether you can have justice depends on the money you've got. And that the lawyering, the bar is made up mainly to make money, to be a parasite on that system. And I felt bad about it. And we were trying to do it as ethically and morally as you could, but it still put us in tension. Somebody comes to you with these horrible stories of destitution, and you're supposed to say, I need $500 or I need $1,000 as retainer fee. So I knew I had to leave that part. And what happened next is by 1978, and I'd gone with Bob in 76, I got exposed to the anti-nuke movement. And all of these little chapters, feels like in my life, I could go on, seem like for hours, because they were so impactful on me. But we can't do that today, I'm sure. But there was a nuclear waste site there. There's a Savannah River plant called the bomb plant right near Allendale. There was another nuclear type thing there. There was a big civil disobedience. Jackson Brown came and played in a cornfield, in a soybean field. Wow, this was a mind blower to get exposed, and I began to read about the Karen Silkwood case. This woman in 74 had been killed. And all that was coming together. So Bob and I were actively involved in that. We drew straws. He won. He got to get arrested in the civil disobedience, and I didn't. So we had fun doing that. We won an important case in his situation when he got tried for trespass in a jury trial. They used in the magistrate's court a state statute that had been on the books since, who knows, I don't know how long, 100 years, I don't know. And literally it said to pick a jury pool from where you select 6 jurors, the sheriff goes out and picks, I think it was 18 good and true, and it might have even said men. Now think about this. The law enforcement official sheriff that's prosecuting you is going to pick the jurors. So we challenged that, argued it in the state Supreme Court, challenged them in other ways, nearly got thrown out, but we won that case, and that overturned. And that makes a point there. For all those years, all the lawyers in South Carolina weren't willing enough to fight the system to challenge what on its face should be seen as a biased statute that goes to the core of, can you have an unbiased, impartial, fair jury trial? Another thing that we challenged in there, and this, an article about our law firm and Bob mainly was, came out in the Sacramento, California, Sacramento Bee newspaper, the Necktie Revolution. We didn't want to wear ties in the courtroom. We said that puts us to look like as if we're on the side of the bankers and the insurance lawyers and the big companies, and we're not. We're out here to be the people's lawyers. And sometimes we'd get thrown out of court. Sometimes we wouldn't, depending on the judge, but we tried to make a principle out of not aligning ourselves with the corporate powers. So, but at some point then, by 78, I'd met, I don't know how much detail, but I met a lawyer named Danny Sheehan and some of his friends, and they were working on the Silkwood case. So to make a long story short, I moved from Allendale, South Carolina, to Oklahoma City to earn nothing but a free place to stay with a volunteer person that had an extra bedroom and room and board to work on the Silkwood case and begin to see what a big national case could possibly look like, all the pros and cons of that. And that sort of set me up to then go and be involved for 2 years, only a little bit with the Silkwood case, but enough to know how I encourage people to read the books. That's the real story. There's a movie about Karen Silkwood, as people know, with Mel Street in it and Cher. But the real behind the scenes story was it was a plutonium refuel. They were making it, fabrication plant. But plutonium, bomb grade stuff, it was somehow, there's all kind of theories that it was being leaked out, sent to Israel. Was it the CIA? Was it the FBI? But we found out how much spying, how much CIA and FBI knowledge there was about following and spying on Karen, and then the anti-nuke movement in itself, and attacks on the labor movement. So these were explosive revelations to me to begin to understand that. So I also had an important revelation out there. So I got admitted to the bar in 1973. I'd say by 79, so 6 years of trying to, I think I used the wording, use law as a tool for social change. I thought that it was all so rigged, I wasn't doing it anymore. I gave up. I took my briefcase, I ceremonially dumped it over a fire out in the woods in the mountains somewhere in Oklahoma, and said, I ain't wasting my time with this. I'm gonna be a freedom fighter. And I mean, literally a freedom fighter, and do whatever it took, by whatever means necessary to fight for justice. And luckily, so I was engaging in civil disobedience, helping other groups. So some delightful stories of finding these wonderful people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that would bring out 300, 400, sometimes 500 people. We'd all get arrested. We'd have a trial. I'd pick up the phone and call up these nationally known health physicists. I think of Dr. John Goffman. He had been tasked by the US government to investigate the medical ramifications of nuclear radiation, I think both from military and the civil part. And his conclusions were, wow, it's killing us. And he became ostracized as a whistleblower. Other folks, but I said, I can't pay you some expert witness fee. I don't even have hardly gas to put in my car. I'm hitchhiking around. But we're gonna have a trial out somewhere in Podunk, Texas, or in Oklahoma, in Rogers County, home of Will Rogers. You wanna come and tell the people. And they will. I get chill bumps as I'm telling this. And he'd pay for his own ticket and come out. And we'd argue duress or necessity. Yes, we non-violently climbed over the fence and got arrested, all 500 or 300 of them. But we had no choice, because the other side of it, and the way Dr. Goffman would frame it sometimes, think of the four corners of that nuclear power plant. If you put a machine gun on a turret on each one of them and began to spray bullets, that's what that plant is doing in terms of radiation. And it was surprisingly successful. We had a trial in Texas where they did that and had expert two experts, as I recall, local country judge who may own land out there. So the judge has to pay attention. Is this plant going to contaminate my property where I can't raise crop or cattle or sell it? They had a little more of a personal stake in this thing. And they would be very helpful, let Goffman testify. So there were 6 members of the jury, these big stereotypic Texas looking guy that looked like they would want to lynch me. I had a longer beard, longer hair. I wore cowboy boots because that's how I am. And they hung up. They wouldn't convict us. And after it, one of the guys that I thought was most likely to want to pinch my little neck right off, he said to the Dallas, seemed like Morning Herald, if I'd have known about all them there dangers to that plant, I'd have climbed over that fence with them kids. So that's how I was still trying to use law as a tool for social change, but then even wanted to get more radicalized, stumbled into the people in 1980 who were looking for somebody to help bring justice from the Greensboro massacre. And the reason they sought Danny Sheehan out is that Danny and his wife, Sarah Nelson, and others of us, a Jesuit father, Bill Davis, had started something called the Christic Institute in Washington, D.C. And long story short, we agreed that we would try to take that on as Christic Institute. It made sense for me to go there with my Southern accent and my connection to the South, even though I had not been doing union labor work. I'd been doing anti-Newt work and some racial justice, but came to Greensboro with an earring on and didn't want to be a lawyer and wanted to be a revolutionary and had followed Che and reading Fidel and all that stuff, and sort of had this third world notion of change and revolution, as if we were going to all get guns and go eat monkeys and live up in a tree like Che and those did. And so the irony there is that people think the Communist Workers' Party, because they're communists, would be the most out of touch. They were very sane and rational people. I know that you talked to my friend and former client, Signe Waller, recently, how wonderful those people were. They were the cream of the crop of loving, caring, and bright people. Her husband had dropped out of med school to go work in a textile mill to be a union leader. They were gunned down, deliberately aided and abetted with the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. But they had a legal part of CWP, and they said, look, man, nobody's saying that the legal system is good. Its whole reason to be in there is to legitimate an oppressive system that protects property. But we have to use that legal system. We have to be in there to defend the movements. When movements fight back, or their elected leaders, African-American leaders were coming up. The Voting Rights Act had passed a decade and more and all that. And they're getting hammered. They're cutting the head off the movement by attacking and framing the leaders. We can't abdicate that system. We have to get in there. And it made a lot of sense. So I got a haircut, I took my earring out, and I began to be a lawyer again and got to know these wonderful people like Reverend Nelson Johnson and his wonderful wife, Joyce Johnson, and so many of Dr. Marty Nathan, and understand and realize how much the red baiting and the Cold War had warped people's thinking and so forth and so on.
Wow. Well, you covered a huge amount of ground. I want to go back just to a few things, back to when you were working with your good friend who sounds wonderful, Warren.
Bob Warren, yes.
Bob Warren in that small town in South Carolina.
Yeah.
Were you, given what you were doing and nobody else was doing, were you worried physically about your safety? Did you get, obviously the local, how was that for you?
Well, we could have gotten, I did not get any threats. Nobody shot at me or fired into the house. I know there was concern about that. Bob had grown up and lived there. His father had run the local pharmacy. And his mom was a teacher. So the local folks, I guess, maybe had a little more of a, they thought we were weird and odd, but maybe tried to tolerate it. The power structure didn't set us up with drugs or frame us, but boy, they just would not want and did not let us win. And they took it out on our clients. So the retaliation was more, if you get these lawyers, it's going to be really tough. So I didn't feel the physical intimidation at that point. And I don't think Bob did either.
Okay, because that always comes to mind given later events and what you read about in the South, of course, especially, but everywhere, obviously.
Well, you know, I guess one thing I need to insert there, because it came to play a little later, is sometimes when you're doing this, you may downplay, you may be in denial about that. I think that was part of the reason, and maybe I don't know, that Bob's family might have broken up, is that they felt there was too great of a risk. And he and I could be in denial about it, so as to continue to do what we were doing.
Well, what about your family? Were your parents worried when you started to become political? How did they feel about it?
Yeah, I'm sure they were, because this is bound to be pretty much a mind blower for them. But I must say they were loving and supportive and tried to understand. My dad was Republican, and he, I think, more the old school. I don't think he'd be a Trump Republican insanity like that. But he didn't understand it as much as my mom, because of her keen interest in learning and some version of liberation theology. She would understand and try to be supportive. They came to some of the oral argument about that we had in the state Supreme Court about how you select the jury. They both came, so they were very supportive of me, even though I don't think they totally understood it. And did not try to control or banish me in any way. She would say that my mom said, a lot of times you took up something 5 years ago, and then now people finally realize it was the right thing. You just happened to get there before it was okay. And some of them. Now, imagine the Communist Workers' Party case. I mean, that was tough for all of us. Here we starting this do-gooder Christic Institute in 1980 with trying to, what we said we were trying to do was take Judeo-Christian principles and ethics. And now I realize even that's too narrow for how I think now, but Judeo-Christian ethics, and compare that to government public policy. And when it's out of sync, be a storefront law firm to expose and bust that. And here we are, and literally there were like 8 of us that started that group, 3 lawyers, and then I guess that'd be 5 lay people. We were making $400 a month if we could raise everybody equally. And how we were going to raise funds to start up this Christic Institute and then take on one of the more controversial cases going in the nation, representing Communist Workers' Party people alleging that the federal government had joined in cahoots using agent provocateurs in the Ku Klux Klan and the local Nazis to murder 5 union organizers who were anti-racist. That was an uphill battle, but we decided to do it because it was the right thing to do.
Well, I mean, I think it could. Now we have interviewed, or the students interviewed, Willina Cannon, we have Sinye, yourself, and I think there's somebody else. Well, Flint Taylor, we interviewed him, remember, about a year ago, and we should maybe talk about him a little bit and how you wanted to talk a little bit about that aspect. But what I'm getting at is if you could lay out just a little bit more what happened in, we were going through this yesterday. the China Grove thing. In other words, you had a group of people, the Communist Workers' Party, who were trying to organize Cone Mills,
Yeah.
which was a textile plant, which is super anti-union, of course. Yeah. So if you could just take us through a little bit more the whole deal with November 3rd, it would be great.
Well, it was called the Communist Workers' Party. Took on that name roughly about November the 3rd of 79. That was, they were going to be a transformation. They were called the Workers' Viewpoint Organization, WVO. And I wasn't part of that. I'd never heard of any of these people. Part of the new left that was coming together of what had been sort of white, anti-war activist, the racial justice, national movements, anti-imperial, all of it blended and tried to put that all together. And at least in North Carolina, there'd been a real focus on Cone Mills, a textile plant, and had organizers that they put there. As I mentioned, one, let's take Signy's husband at that time, Jim Waller. I think he was a medical school professor at Chapel Hill and had been very active in what's the Native American issue that happened in 73? Wounded Knee. He'd been active in all those kind of things. Well, some people call it committed class suicide. He left that strand and went to work at night and labor in a textile mill, and got elected to be president of the union, was exposing the sellout of the establishment union. And one of their main focuses was that the racism has been used to divide black and white workers. And when we try to bring a union campaign to either strike or to vote in a union, they go and say to the whites, blacks are going to get all their jobs and use it as a divide. And then they're going to use the Klan to intimidate. So we're going to take that on. And so when the Klan would try to mobilize, they would be there in some capacity or another, like we're seeing on the streets today, people who were saying, we're just not going to tolerate the fascist arguments of hatred and genocide to people of color. And that was an incident where there was going to be in July of 79 in China Grove, a showing of Birth of a Nation, the racist film. And people came from Durham and Greensboro and all around, black and white together, and stood out in front of that porch. The anti-racist protesters had sticks and wore helmets and were there to say, we're willing to fight. On the porch, the Klan stood with their weapons, firearms. The protesters struck a match to the Confederate flag and burned it. And luckily, nobody was injured. There was no gunfire. But that seemed to be then later used, because you can imagine what that did to rile up the white racist core. There was a United Racist Front that was created then in September of that year. That was an effort to pull together the Nazi groups and the Klan groups, and these groups usually fall out amongst each other. One leader's ripping off the money or whatever. And Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Bureau, had sent a full-time agent, Bernard Bukovich, down, and he was present and watched all that. Probably taped it, but they claimed his batteries were dead, and so we couldn't get the tape when we were litigating. And I need to cut the story a little short, but that ATF and the FBI connected together. And they also, in addition to putting this ATF agent in the Nazi group, they sent him down to track and hook up with Roland Wayne Woods, who their document said, this guy's essentially he's got dynamite, he's got weapons, machine guns, he's really, really dangerous. He was in there, supposedly, Bukovich, to bust him on a firearms. The Greensboro Police Department at the same time found their informant, a guy who'd been an informant for the FBI, who'd worked closely with the Grand Dragon. They worked for weeks planning and organizing a way to come into Greensboro and confront, to challenge, and we know, to attack an anti-Klan demonstration that was going to be occurring, called by the Workers' Viewpoint Organization, to do the things that I was just talking about. Say that the Klan are not powerful, they ride by night, don't let them scare you out of having a union, don't let them tell white people that the union is no good and the blacks, so that's just racism. It's been like that, and we're not going to tolerate it. And the November 3rd anti-Klan march and rally was going to march, as has been a common tactic throughout many movements, go through different housing projects and gather people to end up in a church or a building and have speeches and have an educational forum. They called it a Death to the Klan rally, meaning in the abstract, we don't want that ideology to exist. The informants knew everything about it. The police were telling them where it was going to be. Here you get we had several days before November 3rd, more information than you could put in a trunk came in saying these Klan and Nazis have machine gun. They're talking about shooting up the place. They're coming in from all over. They're going to come in the night before, find a spot. They're going to attack and do violence on the people. The police gave the Klan informant the permit to show where they were going to all do this. Sure enough, that morning of November 3rd, the Klan forms up on the outskirts of town, probably a 15, 20-minute drive on the edge of Greensboro from down to where the housing project called Morningside was going to start. Knowing all of this, not one time did the police or the FBI or ATF warn the demonstrators, tell them, we have information, you're going to be attacked. What the police had done when they issued the permit to the anti-racist demonstrators was tell them, you can't have any weapons, you can't even have sticks. So they deliberately disarmed the demonstrators. And I wasn't there, I wasn't in on the planning, but I've spent hours and years. I have no reason, zero evidence to think that they were expecting and wanted a violent clash. So it's early morning, the Klan and Nazis are forming up. That police informant has literally gone to the FBI prior to this to say, don't let this happen, it's going to be violence. They didn't listen. He went to the city attorney and said, can you join this march? There's going to be violence. Other signals were coming in, as I mentioned, from informants around that there's going to be a violent clash involving machine guns and serious stuff. The police detective handler of the police informant drove out there and actually watched as they took guns and loaded them into these cars. There was a 9-car caravan. Not once did they send an officer or make a radio call, because they didn't want to tell the demonstrators, don't show up. Or neither did they arrest and stop. They clearly had probable cause to stop. In fact, the handler, Detective Cooper, followed in his unmarked car with a photographer, this 9-car caravan, as it drove 15 minutes, headed right to the site where 5 people were going to be murdered in front of TV cameras. Didn't stop them, didn't phone, didn't send anybody, There was not a police officer in sight. In fact, I took the deposition of a woman police officer with her partner who had been in that housing project just before this on a domestic call. And she said she mysteriously got a radio communication that told her to hurry up and finish her call and get out of the area. That caravan drove in while the police photographer photographed it with his still camera. And they calmly opened up the trunk, pulled out rifles, shot and killed 5 brilliant, committed people. It's like a rainbow coalition. Dr. Michael Nathan, who's a pediatrician, shot in the face, died. Jim Waller, the medical doctor, president of the union. Sandy Smith, graduated from Bennett College, had been, I think, student body president, union activist. Cesar Calce, from Cuba, had been at Duke, organizing workers' rights at Duke. And Bill Sampson had been a Harvard divinity student working in the unions. They were killed. 12, 13 other people injured. The neighborhood terrorized at what happened. And then came, and the Klan drove away. And that was back. There were 4, if not 3, if not 4 TV stations who'd shown up to watch the getting together of this thing. It's captured on film. It's kind of like the Rodney King thing. They caught it. And immediately a massive cover-up began. And I blame the victims. You would have thought that those fine 5 people and their spouses and their friends were serial killers and murderers the way they were depicted. Remember, this is right as Reagan is coming in. November 79 is when the massacre took place. Reagan comes in, Cold War is at a height. Massive cover-up. People lost their minds. ACLU, local ACLU would actually say, well, the police really didn't have probable cause to stop the caravan. Well, now, it taught me how ideology can transcend any sense of understanding data or facts, to say that they didn't have the cause given what we pulled together. So the Klansmen were prosecuted in state court, an all-white jury, not guilty. The feds didn't want to pursue the matter for some reason, particularly under Reagan, but community activism with the supporters, the survivors, the legal team, we filed a lawsuit in 1 year later in December with a broad team, and that'll help get me to Flint Taylor in a minute, with Christic Institute, People's Law Office in Chicago, and a broad base. But we brought pressure. The survivors, we would take a bus or we'd get up to Washington, go to the Congressional Black Caucus, have them hold hearings, demand that the feds were saying, we don't have jurisdiction. Well, my God, it couldn't be a more classic, appropriate jurisdiction under the anti-Ku Klux Klan federal statutes. It was labor, which is when the post-Civil War, slaves were then laborers, so it was labor and racism and violence. That was it, rolled up. They were claiming they didn't have jurisdiction. So we had to mobilize law professors and people to say, there's plenty of jurisdiction, you're just not doing it right. It's like today, Trump and Barr, they exercise jurisdiction when and where they want to based on political gain. That was happening here. But we forced them to bring prosecution. They were threatening to indict our people. They didn't. They indicted the Klans and Nazis. They indicted the informant, all-white jury, not guilty. Our lawsuit finally came to be brought in 1985, and we had obtained all of this evidence, a treasure trove of written proof these other assertions that I've been making here. You want to, well, why do you say the FBI was working with alcohol, tobacco, and fire? Well, we got a memo that said it's a joint project of those and mentions Agent Bukovich. We didn't just make this up. We weren't guessing. This is what their documents show. But I had the good fortune to be intimately involved in that and get to meet for the first time Flint Taylor, lawyer out of Chicago. I think you got information about him. He was instrumental in helping us do the discovery in the case, take depositions, and try the case. Mainly Flint and a lawyer named Carolyn McAllister from Durham, and I tried it. It was over a month trial, and we got a partially good verdict. It was a verdict that said jointly liable for the wrongful death of Dr. Mike Nathan were police officers, 2 police officers, and Klansmen and Nazis. We think that was the first Southern or any jury verdict that held complicit this thing that's been going on, complicity between law enforcement and racist violence. And there's a rich history of that sadly isn't part of the curriculum. We're beginning to see it pretty starkly now with the Black Lives Matter movement and from Ferguson, Missouri to all these cases that are now popping out. We see where too much of police department mentality is it's on the side with the right-wing racist, and why we need to be willing to say, I think, worry about fascism and tyranny is run amok. But Flint, I could tell a lot about his work, but he and his law firm represented the family of Fred Hampton, the young African-American Black Panther Party leader who was assassinated in his bed that had FBI involvement. So those are things that I encourage people to study up on. It's not going to yet be in your history book, but it ought to be. It's factual. You can find it. And the sooner you know that pattern in practice, the sooner you can take the strong leaps ahead to draw the powerful conclusions that we need to reform, if not do away with police as we know it. And that there's violence that's going on and it's covered up, and that the legal system is, I should probably scroll back to one of the tactics that started being used during the Reagan administration. It didn't occur against us in this case, but I do want to say a little more about that Greensboro massacre case. Mm-hmm. That thing that I learned from the CWP lawyers, from Arthur Kanoy, famous lawyer, professor, from white woman activist Ann Braden, is that when you combine the First Amendment rights that we have, at least theoretically, as long as we use them and fight for them, to organize, petition, protest, speak out, even do civil disobedience. And you do those things as tactics in public education, working with the media, educating the people what is the truth, in conjunction with litigation tactics. Either you bring the lawsuit, as we did in the Greensboro massacre. We initiated it because those 2 prior cases, we didn't have a say-so in what was presented. The prosecutors did not want the full story to come out because, as I hope you see, if the full story came out to the jury, of all the pre-knowledge, the planning, the preparation by the Klan and Nazis to go attack these people and hurt them, one question should come to mind. Why didn't the cops stop it? Wasn't that the point of it, or was it? And they wouldn't go that area. They downplayed and covered up all the prior knowledge, and they made it sound like it was just a spontaneous shootout that occurred, as opposed to a planned, frankly, it seemed like an assassination. to target activists and leaders. But the powerful movement, so much led by the survivors, the widows, Reverend Johnson and others, to mobilize the faith community, the labor community, and others, was a powerful experience. And it's been my honor to be part of that, to be part of such a legal team that had people like Flint and Carolyn McAllister and some of the national organizations to try to educate the nation more than just have a narrow legal strategy, which seems like the lawyers will come in on a white horse and solve it with a judge. They are usually the problem, not the solution. But it is essential to blend those together in a way that is what I think is law is a tool for social change. And if we're going to be able to have a nonviolent fundamental change or a nonviolent transition, and I say if, because it's not clear, it's going to be like that. But when you start to rig the judiciary, never mind we've rigged the elections to get a Trump in, or all of them, because of the private money that funds public elections. Offices are bought and paid for. It's bribery. You don't have a chance, hardly, few exceptions, to win unless you can produce the big money. But when the judges are rigged, and they are going out of their way to rig the judges, then all those methods that I'm talking about are shut off, and that doesn't leave much chance. I mean, the people alone in the street can do it. But let me go back, and I'll try to be but I've been involved in, what's called Rule 11, Federal Rule of Civil Procedure number 11. It simply says that if a lawyer signs a federal document, a motion or a pleading, that's not grounded in good faith in facts, grounded in good faith in law, and is not done in bad faith, if that lawyer does that, that lawyer can be sanctioned personally. So what began to happen during the Reagan administration is those right-wing conservative judges, the supposed referees in these contests of civil rights, began to use that as an offensive weapon to go against civil rights lawyers. So think of it as the lawyer studies a case, writes it down, says who is doing the bad stuff, and files a case. It's a shooting of the messenger. You shoot the messenger because you don't want to. So one case I was working with Christic Institute, and this is too much to go into, but it was an Iran-Contra case. It involved all that stuff with Oliver North, and young people today don't have much of a clue what I'm talking about, but it was corruption out of the White House. It was running guns for drugs. It was these kind of things. We filed a lawsuit that was trying to expose that and expose the role that George Bush Sr., who's then vice president, was playing in it. People don't know George Bush Sr. had been the head of the CIA in 1976. He's in what Trump now would call the deep state. But we brought out to light the illegal funding of the Contra movement, the anti-communist movement. Anti-communist is what they did to murder the people in Greensboro. That was an anti-communist movement of ATF, FBI, and Greensboro police. They were funding the Contras. And to do it without there being scrutiny from Congress, they had to generate the money. They did it by selling drugs and cocaine. This is pretty well documented. We put that out in a lawsuit. We worked and we managed to raise $2 million and do discovery. Video documented depositions. This was in the mid to late 80s, 88, 89 in there. We were getting ready to have a trial in Miami in federal court where I believe that trial would have exposed what I'm talking about, but also exposed that Daddy Bush had been lying and said he didn't know anything about this illegal operation to illegally fund the Contras. He was running for president. We had invited and had volunteer 40 some odd of the best and wealthiest lawyers in the nation to volunteer to work with us to do this discovery. So what I'm saying is this is not just a bunch of peanut heads throwing together something. This was a well scrutinized and researched big piece of litigation that had been brought to fruition, getting ready to go to trial, that would have, I think, altered the outcome of the '88 election. Right before it was to go to trial, we'd literally moved all of our stuff down to a Catholic campus ready for what was maybe going to be a 6-month trial. The federal judge said, "Oh, I hadn't ruled on summary judgment. I'm throwing your lawsuit out. And by the way, because they made a motion for it, I'm going to impose a sanction on the lawyers and the client." We had 2 journalists that were the clients, of $1.2 million in sanction and fine. Now, so here in the United States, the federal judge and judges, because this same type thing was happening to Julius Chambers, head of NAACP Legal Defense Fund, former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, they were getting sanctioned for saying they filed frivolous lawsuits. We were being shut down. This little storefront law firm that started out with 8 people making $400 a month. We had grown to have 2 offices in DC and out in LA, where there was money being raised. We had 50 people trying to do things that you're supposed to do in a self-governing democracy that uses law for tool for social change. And the supposedly detached referee hit us with $1.2 million and basically crushed the operation. Within a year or 2, Christie had to fold up. That's Rule 11. That's how rigged our system is. And I still believe that, but I also still believe that we need people to go into public interest lawyering and try to work there and challenge and do this comprehensive notion of utilizing the rights of people, recognizing their agency to participate in and in fact have government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And if we don't do that in radical fashion now, which I hope is nonviolent, still radical, the street protest of the last month or 2 since George Floyd is what's brought about. Look at the shift in the dynamic of the dialogue out there about Black Lives Matter and policing and what's going on. That bad scenario has been going on all these years. It's just now getting a different look. So that has chilled lawyers. Think about, you bring a lawsuit that you know the power structure doesn't like. They could go after, not just throw your case out. They could say you owe $10,000, never mind $1.2 million. And we lost. We took that up as U.S. Supreme Court, lost. And the way they would write and define and describe what we did and what compared to what really happened is the difference between Trump's reality and actual reality. You couldn't recognize how that was the same. And I've got another case that they brought against me and prominent civil rights attorney now deceased Bill Kunstler, and against Bill and me and a law professor. That was over a case we brought in Robeson County, a civil case. Too much detail to go into, but it has scared lawyers out of, most of them. That's why I love and appreciate Flint and his colleagues, and there's a few others, not many, that still have the courage to weigh in, plead the truth, argue the truth, and mobilize people to be supporters and not think that the main point is the litigation. The main point is defending and protecting the mass base of movement for people who then can throw their weight around to finally get us what may be a meaningful democracy.
Well, now back to that $1.2 million. You didn't have to pay that, did you?
I say we paid it. A wealthy person out in California, because we had a lot of support from Hollywood. You know, I got to go with Danny and some people out to Chris Christopherson's home in Maui in Hawaii to attend a National Association of Trial Lawyers. So I didn't see Christopherson, but he was willing to be in supportive of our cause. And we went out there to talk about this very case. So we had somebody posted the bond for us so it could go up. That person lost it. And then the effort to discredit. See, let me go back to, it began to be revealed, as you know, Matt, in the early 70s about an FBI program under Hoover called the Counterintelligence Program. It's called for short COINTELPRO. And we have the actual memos that they wrote. And essentially, they say starkly in these words, there's no ambiguity. We need to be not police in the criminal sense. We need to be political police. That we need to, people who are the women's liberation movement, the national Black liberation movement, the Black Panther Party, the anti-war people, the anti-imperial people, all the people like me, and I hope most people out there, if they start being effective, we need to do operations that discredit, the quote, discredit and neutralize and disrupt them. And they would try to send memos and act as if a Black Panther Party or a faction that was stealing money from another Black group, so they would try to have gang wars. That's what's being done. That's the effort to discredit and neutralize. And by calling the lawyers and their clients bad faith litigators, that you didn't have the facts supported, it's labeling it. It's just a version of fake news. It's the way they put fake news out, but with a punitive, chilling effect on people and the lawyers. And I became so disenchanted and physically and emotionally impacted by the hypocrisy of this legal system that I quit it in 2014. I'd practiced for over 40 years, not like I didn't try from the inside, but I wrote a lengthy letter and explained to the North Carolina Bar that a lawyer, according to the rules of professional conduct, a lawyer is supposed to be three things: a good advocate for the client, an officer of the court, and, quote, a public citizen with a special responsibility for the quality of justice. And I said, I don't see that happening at all. In fact, the bar has become, and the bar is not supposed to be a business. Profession is a professed calling. It's like theology and medicine. You're not supposed to make bucks. That's a calling. Law's supposed to be like that. It's not that. It's become infected with, contaminated with the morals and manners of the marketplace, as one former Supreme Court justice called it. And I said, I don't want to be associated with you. I quit. They tried to tell me I couldn't quit. But you can't quit. You can just be inactive. I had to threaten to litigate, force them to create a rule that would allow lawyers to relinquish, quit the bar. I just couldn't stand it anymore. I feel it's that corrupted. But I nevertheless urge people to be lawyers and do it the right way. I just couldn't from my personal standpoint.
Well, what were some of the impacts on you, your life for the enormous amount of stress you've gone through and worrying about this 1.2 million. I mean, that's a lot of huge pressure to, that has an impact on you and your family. And talk about that.
Well, that one and the one that was rendered here in North Carolina because of representing Native Americans in Robeson County who were being framed, and the movement was being under attack. That was added up to something like $140,000. Well, I tell you, when you doing this work, I never tried to and never amassed any wealth and never amassed a reputation amongst the traditional bar necessarily. But I did, and I still am proud of and want to be proud of my principles and my integrity and my moral base that I'm doing this, it's right. And to have twice be effort to discredit me with those Rule 11 sanctions, and there are many other ways that it goes on, that's very painful. So I went through a period after the second Rule 11, I literally wanted to go up to everybody on the street and say, I didn't do it, man. I didn't do that. That's all a big lie. In fact, when I was living in Durham, coming out of the Iran-Contra one, letterhead stationery was created by the right-wing forces, and it was captioned "Victims of the Christic Institute." And they would write these letters and say, the Christic Institute is a complete fraud. It tells you out there that it's a Judeo-Christian-based faith group doing good stuff, so you can give tax-deductible contributions. All they then do is take your money, fabricate these outlandish-sounding cases about law enforcement and violence and drugs. That's kind of what Robeson County had been about. That's what Iran-Contra was about. That's sort of what's been going on. And milk you out of your money. Don't believe them. Look, 2 federal judges have called BS on them. And that would be sent around the nation to newspaper editors. And it would get published in short, signed by Ambassador so-and-so or former ambassador. So anybody that's not paying pretty good attention to where the truth is reading that, and it made it nearly impossible to fundraise anymore. The funders don't want it. That's why the big Christic in DC basically shut down early, I don't know exact date, by early 90s, by 94. I went separate from Washington Christic and did a racial justice effort along with the Greensboro Massacre. I had some fascinating cases there, man, around the South about racism and framing Black people and not letting a little majority Black town get started in Keysville, Georgia. Meet these wonderful, loving people. It's just so fortunate. And I had a board of directors that had John Hope Franklin, Cornel West, Hayward Burns, who's a very prominent African-American lawyer and scholar, Mayor Gresham, and others like that on it. I've got the handwritten letter that John Hope Franklin wrote to John Lewis saying, John, look at this group. They need help out here fighting these things. We couldn't find the money. So we had to shut that down. I went to work for Legal Aid, which was the most established job I've ever had, most money I'd ever made, and that's not there very much. And had delightful experiences there. For a while, I ran the mental health unit and got to see what it's like. This was, mid-90s, to go to the institutions where mentally ill people are locked in there. I mean, this is the cell door type thing. I'd go in and ask them, how they were being treated, and you begin to say, there's no treatment in there. It's nothing but custodial care and physical abuse and bombarded with drugs. And many of them would be in there for a year or two till we begin to privatize it and they begin to throw them out in the street. Now we literally put them in a jail. But that has been a broadening experience to understand the mental health system and lack of system and how much that impacts on families. And of course, I also developed a habit in 1985 when we were about to have my son, Stephen, with children and children's rights. Oh my gosh, children treated like property. They don't get to have an actual say in a court proceeding that has the most significant bearing on, are they going to have to go back? Is that 14-year-old girl going to have to go back and live with her stepfather who is raping her? Begin to see and understand the school to prison pipeline and fight that, the racism there. It was tracking kids right over into prison. So I've been fortunate to get to see and know these wonderful people and these wonderful movements, and still try to be active as much as I can, but I feel happy that there's so many young people beginning to take the leadership up and do it effectively and courageously with a lot of spunk and boldness, because that's what we need. And it's also nice that there's an understanding of appreciating elders and trying to learn. I wish I could take the learning experiences that I've tried to summarize with you, maybe too long, and put it in a capsule and hand it to somebody so they could then start right where I am and not have to go through, well, the police, it was just a misunderstanding, you know, and give every benefit. We don't need to give the benefit of the doubt to this categorically rigged system. And if I guess in closing, I've tried to do a lot of study. I think that's important. Study and in practice, more study and practice and keep learning. But let's start only with the beginning of our country. It's been the same thing. A ruling, wealthy elite, whether that was coming from feudalism or what, to the emerging capitalist system, have wanted to maintain and control power. The Enlightenment period and our revolution and all these ideas from Thomas Jefferson about people power and self-governing democracy, wonderful. That's like letting the genie out of the bottle. It's wonderful. But they've used it, and look how many devices have been used, from Jim Crow to poll taxes, to literacy tests, to all that they're doing today to suppress the vote, to allow the minority, the few, the wealthy, to continue to rule. But the earth can't sustain it anymore. Look at the storms that are raging, the fires that are raging now. If we drop a dot down here in the history of what's going on, Matt, right now as you and I talk, fires are burning in Wisconsin because of protest and people rebelling over police killing a black man, shooting him in the back. Winds are blowing, hurricanes are coming in. There has to be a fundamental transformation to stop this capitalist imperative of accumulating more and more wealth through more and more growth, which inevitably has always exacerbated inequality. And we can't and won't tolerate it anymore. And as you maybe can tell, I hope at 72 years old, I'm still burning and alive with that. I can't do as much, and I'm trying not to do as much, but that's a fire that if we want our progeny, if we want the future generations to have life in any way that's decent, we better take heed to it and engage and realize that democracy is not something you have, it's something you do.
Wow. You know, Louis, this has been very powerful. You know, Spoma gave me the write-up of your many wonderful victories when you were nominated for the award from the NAACP, which you did receive. You want to talk about that? Some of your, talk about that. That's an incredible honor.
Well, I was pleased that Spelman made that nomination, and it was received, and I got it. I was really honored to be there and be recognized as a part of the NAACP spirit and movement to bring about change and work actively in a community. Very proud of that. I received the, forgive me, I forget what it's called, but I think it was 2014, the statewide state ACLU award. So, you know, there's some recognition for this stuff. You don't do it for recognition, but at least if by getting recognized, it can help you keep moving. And by doing so, it shares the facts of what you do and the causes that you've been aligned with to spread the word on that. It's part of an educational component. So that's been delightful and helpful.
Well, have you mentored young lawyers and young activists? So I'm sure you have over the years to carry on the fight.
Yes. In fact, moving to Greensboro in 1980, and then while that lawsuit was sort of waiting or getting ready, so from 80 to 85 and then on up until 94, part of our, and also I need to mention a woman lawyer named Gail Karotkin that I worked with, both very closely on the Greensboro massacre case. And then even when that was over, we had started, it's called Christic Institute South. And then we later changed that name to Southern Justice Institute. We had as part of our model, we wanted to be like a strike force. I had to use these military or a SWAT team for the movement. So we had two lawyers, Gail and me, and we would try to hire as an apprentice a young African-American lawyer, and did. We had a woman once and a couple of guy lawyers to train them, to let them see this style of lawyering where you do the purpose to serve and protect the movement. And that was, I'm sure, exciting for them. They've given us good feedback. They thought that was very helpful. Then after a year or so, because we didn't have much money to pay them to move up in a career, they may then go out on their own, and we sort of seeded a sprout out there. And then if they had their own practice on the side, they could take up some of the political cases. And I always enjoy speaking at law schools to law school classes. Usually within a class, there's a certain percentage, it's never large, that are there because same reason I went. It's not to make big bucks or to be a politician. It's to, wow, how about using this law as a tool for social change? How does that work? So I've tried to hand down and synthesize and summarize the things in the lessons so they don't have to repeat the lessons. You can see what I learned from Arthur Kanoy and the Flint Taylors and Bill Kunstler and those other lawyers like that. That's mentoring, I think, is very, very important.
And since we're talking about right now, how about the current case, the vigil every Monday with a hog tie case? Can you briefly comment about that?
Yeah. In September the 8th, 2018, a homeless African-American man, I think he's like 38 years old, was having not exactly a seizure. He was doing drugs. He was having a mental health breakdown. He had mental health diagnoses. He was in the street, roaming and walking around, not plundering, not committing a crime. Actually, he was begging for help. It was like he was high, like a buzzed up. Help, they're after me. Somebody's trying to get me. Please take me to the hospital. Please take me. The Greensboro police sort of surround him, and for a while are reasonably gentle and talking to him. And he said, take me to the police. They say, okay, get in the police car. He gets in the squad car. They shut the door. There's nobody in it, nobody to drive it. He's caged up in that back little seat thing and begins to get even more frantic. And he hadn't pounded or kicked, but he starts to push and hit at the door. They open the door. He voluntarily gets out. He's surrounded by several police officers. There's 8 total there. They grab him. They push him down on his stomach. And they do what any officer should know you shouldn't do, what in theory their training has told them not to do, and the manufacturer of this strap that I'm going to mention tell you categorically don't do. They hogtied him, meaning they had handcuffed his hands behind his back. They cuffed or tied up his ankles and then pulled his ankles up while he was down on his chest. So all of his weight is on his body. It's since the mid-90s, the U.S. Justice Department and other people have said, you don't do that because people die from positional asphyxiation. They put him down like that, held him, pressed on him. Didn't take very long, essentially it killed him. He died. The police, they tried to cover it up to begin with. Police chief said, issued a release the next day. We came upon this man, he collapsed and died. They didn't mention that they used a rip hobble, that's the manufacturer's name for the device they hogtied him with. Tried to screen that out. Didn't tell the parents that they'd restrained him in a way that was deliberately indifferent, if not intentional, to hurt him. Then it got to be that the NC medical examiner was going to come out with a report, autopsy, etc. Medical examiner ruled it's a homicide. Mentioned that he had drugs in his body. Nobody's denying that. But they called it a homicide. That's a killing caused by other human beings. The city's been massive cover-up mode. They don't admit they've done anything wrong. They won't. Luckily, and I'm proud to say, because I've maintained good friendship with Flint, and because I know a local lawyer in Greensboro, Graham Holt, we connected all that together, and there's a nice big federal lawsuit with Graham Holt and Flint and the People's Law Office leading that. They're doing discovery right now at the moment. The city is paying $300 an hour to private lawyers. They've already spent, I believe it's $260,000 on lawyers to defend and cover up this homicide, and they're refusing to settle with the parents of Marcus Smith. So that has captured the minds of a lot of people. This coming September the 8th will be the 2nd anniversary. We plan to have big rallies, to have street demonstrations. Glad to say it, I hope we have civil disobedience. Seems to be the only thing that makes the city and these officials around. Greensboro is somewhat contrasted. Minneapolis, they fired the officers, they indicted them. Here, nobody's been fired. Nobody's been indicted. They're all back on the force. It's got to stop. And Greensboro has had a similar history. Greensboro, the same place where the Greensboro Massacre occurred, I could fill in between 79 and now many other, dozens of other examples of police violence, racist-based, it's concealed and covered up by a culture of corruption, and it involves police associations. We don't have union here, but police association and collusion with the elected officials, and that's not that dissimilar to what's gone on and is going on in most other cities. That's why it's at a crisis moment right now, and people are in the street and things are burning, sadly.
Which then they're using, to try to bring it
to
back.
Justify repression. And, history will show at this point, Trump is framing that it's all about law and order, and that the justice-loving people are really maniacs who are running amok. and promoting random violence. I don't think anybody's promoting that. You can't oppress people but so long, and when they have no other remedies, they fight back, they lash out too often in irrational, arbitrary ways. But if we talk about reparations, and I believe in the notion of reparations. I don't think a big hunk of money can be handed out generally to every person who had a family slavery. But think about this thing. In our system, that's what our Disneyland democracy pretends. We have this fake democracy, like those fake dinosaurs at Disneyland or Disney World, fake volcanoes. We have fake system. They're supposed to be compensatory damages and punitive damage that are awarded to people, to their families if they're killed, paid for by the people who did it, and as a punishment. That's what the city of Greensboro should think about, is think of that the settlement of this case for a reasonable amount. What's the value of the life of this man that was needlessly killed? How do you can't put a meaningful dollar sign on it, but that's the way we've been doing it. That compensation should be thought of as a reparation. And if we started to do those kinds of things, and if that system actually did what it's supposed to do, we may not have a car lot that was burned and torched at that town in Wisconsin.
How do you feel?
Things, yeah, go ahead, man.
I was going to say, isn't the city, not to get too much in the weeds in this thing, but city council in Greensboro theoretically, is it mostly Democrats? I mean, so there's kind of a liberal. Point.
Oh yeah, this is the veneer. This is the veneer of like a progressive or a New South. Our city council is made up of 9 people, 8 women, and 1 African-American man who went to Duke Law School. Now you would think, wow, not so. I believe they all purport to be Democrats. That tells us why we've got such a big problem with one party that's 2 wings, all the party of the corporate world. But they're not getting it right. They say some words. They have online seminars. We now have an African-American chief of police. We have an African-American assistant city manager for public safety. He used to be a police officer. They are fronted. They are used to say, oh, we love the community and all the nice things out there. Meanwhile, as I've just described, where it matters about resolving the case, settling it, admitting wrongdoing, rooting out the cause of it, which was lack of training, lack of supervision, deliberate cover-up, they're not doing any of that. It's like the magician. Watch my mouth and my hand over here, while with this hand, I'm stealing your wallet. And it's an illusion. And we, the people here in Greensboro, have to throw them all out. If they can't stand up and take a stand and be clearly counted here and not fall prey to the police association and whatever else it is, they're not the people's representatives. And I think most people, a broad array of people, not, as they say, just a few of us that are stuck in 1979, it's a growing larger group, are going to insist and demand that they be tossed out and replaced with people who understand and believe in transformational leadership.
So do you have much sense of optimism for the future?
I'll tell you, that's a tough one. I have to, because it's sort of a matter of faith. I believe that if, and then the if is big, but if and when the people manifest their agency and realize that they are entitled to, that there's a right we have to self-govern, and start acting as opposed to deferring, wow, things can change. And I often say to my organizer friends, what we could not do and shouldn't even talked about doing 6 months ago is possible now. Now, we haven't pushed it to the qualitative level here in Greensboro yet, but as I mentioned way back earlier, the dialogue, the national dialogue and discussion has shifted some. So I do think and want to believe, because I'm not going to accept the alternative, do nothing. If nothing else, that's my one ethical way that I can be true, is to resist and speak out as long as I'm able, whatever happens. And as more and more people do that, I think it will turn. It's to be determined if we can turn away from fossil fuel and global warming quick enough to have enjoyable, sustainable life here. But even with that being an if, it's not an argument in my mind to stop. That's like quitting. Never get to first base if you never go to the batter's box. So, and you know, I learned from, I think it's Vaclav Havel, hope is not an assessment of the state of the world. Hope is an orientation of your mind and your heart. If you have an orientation towards hope and faith, you can create that reality. We start to assess, as too many people do, the unending list of insanity that the Trump people have put forward and how often the Democrats have sold out. I think knocking Biden off the ticket, so to speak, this time, and, you know, giving us, not Biden, Bernie, knocking Bernie Sanders off. But we need to know that. But the other more important part, if you will, the half glass full, is the orientation of your head and your heart to care for people, even in a social distancing pandemic, associate and organize and mobilize and educate and agitate, and believe in the power of the people. People power, proven to work. Labor movements made changes, 8-hour day, all these things. Women's movement, African American movement, we can go on and on, but it's a paradox. The minute I believe I don't have that power, I won't pick up my pen and tablet and make a phone call, or I won't go to the Zoom meeting. I'll say, screw it. And I'll just sit back and whine or veg out in front of a movie or overdrink or overeat or whatever. So if we continue to believe and share, I enjoy what I call spiritual Gatorade. I've been calling it that for decades. I keep in my briefcase or backpack always a stack of sayings, quotes from people, men and women, that are inspirational. They don't necessarily have to be poems, or it can be a little something like Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. Or Howard Zinn is very good with having quotes that will give us inspiration. And just like you have to refuel your car, refuel your body, we need to refuel our hope and faith mechanisms with whatever your individual spiritual Gatorade may be. It may be dancing, may be meditating, it may be multiple things, but we need to do that to keep our energy tank alive.
Well, you are an incredible inspiration, and Spoma and Walina and Sidney and all the wonderful people that we can mention here. And I think one thing, is they've been, the opposition, the enemy, has been using that term, the shock doctrine, the great book by Naomi Klein. And I think they've used it very effectively to just numb people, one outrage after another, the latest being the post office, destruction of the post office. We could go 4 years of unending destruction, cutting back on food stamps, the present thing, standing by while people are no new bill to help people out or stop the evictions, and the EPA destruction. It's just it's discouraging. It's meant to destroy people's spirit and fighting resistance. And it's easy, to be honest, sometimes I feel very discouraged myself with the, things going backwards. I mean, all these interviews that people such as yourself or people like Reverend Cardis, who went through unbelievable terror to get the right to vote and so on and so forth. And yet here, they're still going at it, trying to stop it. So I guess my question, I think you've answered partially, but how one keeps a sense of faith. I mean, for a lot of people, it may be more of a spiritual, often a religious thing, but for you, what balm do you have?
I'm not part of any institutional religion. I kind of don't know how I would define God, so I don't. It's hard not to define that as a old man with a beard and a robe or something. It's been decades, if or longer, since I had that. But I feel there's a cosmic oneness. There's something about cosmos, which is sort of the coming together, the connected. It's more of an Eastern philosophy, I guess, the oneness of things. And there is a beauty and a in sync connectedness of out in nature. So being out in nature and being with other people and helping and serving is a way to get that spiritual Gatorade and recharging. That the thing about, and I know what I'm questioning a core tenet of liberation theology, which is that there's a God who cares about history and acts in history. And I'm just wondering if it's that way. I would expect her, it, he, them to have hurried up and act, and not the amount of person-created suffering. I think that separates a lot of us activists to the core types. How much is an acceptable amount of pain and grinding poverty? And I've often said, if psychological pain and misery and hurt and stress were converted to blood, we'd have it. The earth would probably be filled up to here with that. We need to see the pain that is happening in every of these poor neighborhoods, black and white, where amphetamine, opioid addiction is rampant, people self-medicating. This is just not tolerable. And I always believed the Che Guevara point that the true revolutionary is motivated by love. You need to love. That's the loving, that why you care. That's where empathy, I think, comes from. You feel that pain. But anchoring in love in no way says you can't be outraged. And maybe you can tell it. I remain outraged at how long this has gone on, how stark and clear it can be, how sadly successful the education system has been to cover it up and create a veil, to create a distortion, to give us a version of history that has wiped out most of the people's movements and that doesn't talk about the corporate. Today, that Hamilton could be deemed so famous because maybe I'm going off, I don't have a script, but I'm just telling you one thing. Manuel, what's his name? Miranda. I mean, the guy comes on television, he does ads for Capital credit cards. And he's made a national hero out of Alexander Hamilton, who was the bank man who said he didn't believe in real democracy. He thought literally the rich and the well-born should rule the country. He never believed in that we should have an inclusive concept of suffrage that involved everybody, because everybody has human dignity. And if you therefore have dignity, you get a reasonable say in what's going to happen as we construct the society. And we've got to get at a telling of the actual truth. And that's why I admire my wife, Swoma Jovanovic, and her work, you as a professor. The teaching world, the education world, really is a frontline place to start teaching this critical pedagogy. And we have to stop the notion that education is to prepare you for a job. That was almost the flow of from Bill Clinton, everybody. We got to prepare you to compete in the global economy. Compete is ultimately leads to war. We need cooperation. And the most important purpose of education, and you used to hear it framed this way more, the Jeffersonian type way, is to prepare you for citizenship. What does it take if we want to have and believe in a self-governing constitutional democracy of the people, by the people, for the people? They need to have the benefit of the raw, awful history of colonialism, imperialism, genocide of the Native Americans. We need to teach the kind of thinking that a self-governing citizen has to have. And I call it the 3 C's. It's critical thinking, and it's creative thinking, transformation to what? New. And then courageous thinking, because when you start thinking and talking like that, somebody's going to try to cut your funding or deny you tender or fire you from your high school job because you stepped on a flag, as happened to that guy making a point out in where it was near Fayetteville. So we have to, one of the most revolutionary places to do work is K through 12 and higher education, to demand that social justice be an aspect when all the powers, the Koch brothers, the big money, are arrayed, the Pope Foundation and people here, they have minions that crank out their articles that trash lefty professors who have the audacity to talk about social justice as if somehow that's wrong to talk about. There are values embedded in these constitutional founding documents. There's some bad stuff in those things, man. Embrace slavery, believe me, I get it. But the notion of all people created equal, that we have that the purpose of government is to establish, that's a verb, justice, that to seek out the common good, the general welfare, those are values, not the 10 Commandments, not the Bible. We're not doing it, going over there with it. But those values need to be taught in school as civic values and ethics about how you live a good life that is, however you want to frame it, wherever wherever a priori it comes from, your God, your Iman, your however you do it, from the sun, grandmother moon, but enact it here. And we have to teach our children that, to share. And right now, these very concepts are being trashed and have been as communism or socialism or something wrong. But I don't think those old tropes are going to last too much longer. They can't. They're wearing out.
Just like, absolutely. Okay, well, I know this has been an incredible interview, and I want to thank you. And I know you have other things to do.
Yeah, you too. Thank you, man. I enjoy talking with you, and I appreciate a project like this.
Absolutely. One final thing, though, like Columbo, remember that old TV show with the lawyer? Not a lawyer, the detective always had one more quote with his beagle. And he always went after the rich and powerful who thought, who is this Columbo? But anyway, I think there's a lot of fear out in the land, and you've been a courageous person throughout your life. I get you like to fight, and I heard something fight in terms of what were mental combat or the combat in a courtroom, that November 3rd commemorative celebration, or however you want to put it, at Bennett last November. Yeah. That was very powerful. Somebody said, fighting is winning. And I'm struck by that. When you fight, you win. You may not win that fight, but you're winning because you're fighting. How did you deal with the fear that most people are not willing to do a lot? Honestly, it's much easier to go along with the tide. How did you learn to fight the fear that you may have felt in your life?
A good question. And, you know, I never was shot at or beat up or lynched and all that. So my fear, if you will, the danger was, it's pretty intimidating to be sitting in front of a judge and all that powerful stuff with all the tools they've got, and basically tell them without mincing words, you know, what you think and what's right. So I felt the fear, and I would have to steel myself, be ready for it, and remember not to soft pedal it. And in fact, I rarely admit, many times, be provocative. Say it precisely to provoke, because it needs to be said. And I'm very proud of some of them. It's a war story. We were in I have to set the context, but it was a federal trial, the 2 Native Americans in Robinson County. They had taken, it's too much to go into, but the federal judge was basically doing everything in his power to hurt our defense and help the prosecutor. So I said, Judge, why don't you just pull up a chair over there with the prosecutor and sit with him if you're going to help him like that? And, you know, lawyers don't usually do that. And I hadn't pre-planned it because it hadn't come up, but it needed to be said. And I'm glad I said it, because they need to be, they talk about prophets speak truth to power. I don't claim any religious prophetic connection there, but there's something about a power, just like fighting is winning. That's a version of the fighting, is to use those words. And I'm proud that I've done that a lot. And I know that the people, one, also I think it models. Think about it. If you're a person of color or poor folk, and you've got a lawyer who's white and therefore potentially privileged, and he or she won't even speak it out, why should they speak it out? So I wanted to model, yeah, I got an advantage, I can do it and may or may not get fired or be hungry, but I want to show you that this is what we all have to do, and I'll do it with you. I'll get arrested with you. I've been arrested, I think it's 7 times for civil disobedience. So it's not just about stand back and let them take all the heat and then write a fancy brief. It's engage with it also. And that's a form of resistance, and going to the defense of others just seems, I don't know, I like to think that that's one of the traits that is human. We've had such a rotten culture. I worry that it's starting to taint what is defined as human nature. You know, ever since Margaret Thatcher and Reagan and neoliberalism and all that, they want us to say there is no more collective, there is no more society and group, maybe your family. It's individual. That's by design. That's to make us totally not believe the very important labor motto, if you will, injured one is an injured all. Right. You know, and we got in the word solidarity. That's I think a very spiritual solidarity, and and injustice is a breach, a tearing of the solidarity and oneness that we all should be feeling. And fighting, I don't know, it's just what has to be done.
You are something else. One final thing. So what did the judge say when you told him to go over to the...
He called me up to the bench, I believe it was, and said, so out of the meaning it doesn't get heard in the crowd. And he said, and of course the newspapers wrote it up the next day. People were going, whoa, whoa. And I believe this is when he said, when this trial is over, we'll have a hearing on contempt. Well, our 2 Native American men had been charged with kidnapping and 17 kidnaps and gun violations and all that, because they did take over the local newspaper in protest of the corruption by the law enforcement in drug trafficking that was killing their people, and deaths that were occurring in the cell. That's a longer story. But lo and behold, our guys admitted that they did what they did, but said they felt compelled to do it. And the jury turned them loose. It was an acquittal. It was an absolutely shocking verdict, which spoke politically to that jury believed that the corruption in Robeson County was so deep and bad that they were willing to say not guilty to these guys that took guns and went in and took over the local newspaper, which is, I have to say, is a very drastic thing. So when all that happened, the judge never got around to calling me back up.
Unbelievable. All right, my friend.
Thank you for your time.
I appreciate it deeply. Take
See
care.
you, man.
Peace.
Bye-bye. Say hey to Cornelia.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.